In the dirt, 6 young women knelt. Beyond the ranch of Thaddeus Bell, their faces are strewn with dust and sorrow. Yet no one had spoken as they pleaded for assistance. In 3 years to another soul, and what they were going to ask him. If he would him to thoroughly consider his protected seclusion and much more, the sun beat more dangerously than loneliness. Ruthlessly down on the isolated valley where Thaddeus had constructed his stronghold of in-stillness, his grizzled hands held he gazed at the porch railing. Unbelievably, he saw 6 figures, bowing like shattered people with ripped dresses. Dolls in the context of his unending fence line that the youngest child was unable to be older than 17. The oldest could be 25. He had a sandpaper-like throat. 3. He hadn't heard a human voice in years. It wasn't his voice reverberating from the canyon walls after 3 years of purposefully selected this life, severing all the ties that held him to the world outside his boundaries. Took 2 days to travel to the closest town. Dangerous. Terrain, nobody arrived here by accident, but in this case, they were the ones who her golden hair lifted her head, revealing her there was a desperate look in his green eyes. Acknowledged despite having spent years attempting to ignore the expression she opened her mouth to speak, but it was a whisper. She let out a croak and her lips broke. Face hollowed out from fatigue, whatever had brought them here after a long journey. And endured a lot of suffering. Thaddeus sensed his well-built walls start to shake. Every instinct cried out to him to turn around and go back to his cabin, and act as though this instance never occurred. He had discovered the hard way that assisting others just caused suffering. Therefore, trust was a luxury that he was no longer able to afford alone. Always alone was the safest place. However, when the woman with auburn hair struggled to stand shaking, something dangerously awakened a sensation in his chest that he'd buried so deeply that he was nearly persuaded the sense that it was dead for him. It's possible that fleeing wasn't the woman took a step to ensure her safety. Move her voice, which was hardly audible, across her words, and the distance between them would break the silence he had created, like armor about himself, and once stated that they wouldn't be taken back due to what she was going to say. He would disclose that his 3-year history of being alone had seemed little in comparison to he was going to have to make the decision. That the voice of the auburn-haired woman broke as she spoke, but what she said pierced the blade-like desert air. Please, mister, there is nowhere else for us to go. There Thaddeus gripped the porch, hunting us, tightening the rail, his knuckles turning white. Hunting in the sun-bleached wood, the term brought back recollections of the time he had spent years of repressing pictures of another woman, another fervent request, another the point at which he had made a poor decision. His jaw tightened until it hurt. You must go, he retracted his voice. I'm rusty from lack of use, but even as he was saying those things, he discovered information that made his stomach turn. The woman's clothing is twisted with fear, was shredded in addition to being torn. Locations that alluded to ominous brutality. The fabric had minor stains that appeared suspiciously similar to dried blood. The other 5 ladies displayed same symptoms of harsh treatment. Whether it was those who had fled it had already caught up with after the woman staggered forward. Her hand pressed to her as she took another stride. Sighed as she removed it. Thaddeus observed new blood leaking through her. His breath got stuck in his throat. She may have been seriously injured, and they all appeared nearly lifeless from fatigue and dehydration. They took 3 days of our wagon. Back, she said, her voice becoming louder. Weaker claimed to have killed our guide. Worse if they discovered us once more. You're the only soul and our final hope, mister, between this location and the boundary. Adjacent, the word struck Thaddeus like a punch to the body. These weren't merely distressed travelers. Whatever the issue, they were fugitives. They brought with them would end up being his difficulty as soon as he made them shelter. He had previously learnt that lesson, and it had cost him everything in the past. Thing was important, but as he observed the woman sways from foot to foot, her face expanding paler the moment anything entered his body, cracked and was about to pass out. All were, and whether he had already sent them away, their death warrants would be signed by him. As certain as though he had pulled when he triggered himself, the woman's legs gave way, In the dirt, she collapsed to her knees. Blood is now seen as a developing stain, and the other women in the dust underneath her hurried to her aid, exposing their own frailty. Neglected in their haste to assist, Thaddeus, their commander, discovered himself down the steps of the porch. Before his 3 years for his mind to catch up to his body of seclusion had imparted numerous lessons to him. But that aspect of him had not been killed. That was unable to observe another person. He didn't suffer while he had the ability to stop it. But as he got closer to among the women, a strange sound came to his hoof-beats and ears far away. But increasing closer, several horses moving quickly, someone is walking on the hard-pan desert floor, was approaching, and they rode hard. A woman with reddish hair also heard it with fear. Her face blazed as she grasped Thaddeus's blood-stained arm. "They found us," she whispered, fingers. Thaddeus said, "Dear God, they found us." Stared toward the direction of a cloud on the horizon. In the distance, a cloud of dust rose. Whoever was on their way would arrive here. The time, and when they got there, they would discover 6 women who were obviously sprinting. From one man who was around and something to learn that certain decisions can't be Thaddeus's thoughts, were racing as he determined the alternatives and distances the riders would approach his ranch. 6 women were injured in less than an hour. Couldn't, in particular, outrun mounted men not in their present state, but to assist them would be to destroy the shelter he had constructed after 3 years of careful segregation allows them to enter the herd himself, utter the phrase, feeling unfamiliar to his tongue. Now a woman with auburn hair who presented herself feebly while Clara attempted to object. "We won't cause you any trouble. We can hide among the rocks, sir." Death. "In the rocks," Thaddeus said. To put it plainly, he was already shifting his instincts for survival, overriding 3 years of those. "Horsemen and the self-imposed herdage will discover your bodies in the morning. They'll be aware that someone assisted you." Collected a blonde, who was the weakest woman, just out of adolescence, who appeared to be burning feverishly into his arms. He was startled to learn that she was nothing but lighter than a feed bag in terms of skin and bones. When was the last time he held a human? It was like touching a memory. The other women stood by each other, as they staggered in the direction of his cabin. The details that Thaddeus observed made his rope burns on the jaw as it clenches in rage. The bruises on their wrists in the form of these fingers around their throats were victims as well as fugitives. Within the cabin's single room that had been for 3 years, the women in his entire globe fell to whatever surfaces they could see that the difference was startling. Area that had felt suitable minimal for a man who has no needs from now, the world felt excruciatingly small, and Clara, insufficient for 6 needy souls, put more pressure on her with her hand. Injured sighed as she surveyed she looked at the lone bed in the cabin. The entire set of minimal furnishings, lack of anything indicating had a woman ever resided here. "You're even so?" she replied. "It wasn't a challenge." "By choice," Thaddeus answered, already in the process of blocking out the windows, "and you're about to find out why." Through the openings in the shutters made of wood he observed the dust cloud expanding. Bigger, the riders were exerting a lot of force, which indicated that they were either desperate or to capture their target or be certain that were neither boated nor close. He asked Clara, "Who are they?" As he examined his gun, feeling the weapon odd in his hands after all this time, but Clara's face was returning to its muscle memory, became pale, whispering, "Slavers. They purchased us from a man who assured us labor in the region stated that we would be educators and tailors. Rather," she pointed to her ripped gown and her bruised throat where his veins felt like ice, "the worst predators are slavers. Sort that considered people to be livestock to be purchased and sold in the manner that would murder anybody stood in their way." And the hoofbeats on their farm, where he was now close enough to at least be able to identify individual horses. 6 cyclists, possibly more guys in the industry who wouldn't be put off by even one rancher's disobedience, as Clara found it difficult to endure, her face contorted in agony and resoluteness. She uttered something that Thaddeus's blood ran cold. "Because of something more, you should be aware of something that is more detrimental than you," I believe Thaddeus was struck by Clara's following comments. The man who sold us was like a physical blow. He is a federal marshal to the slavers. Badge and Wade's entire name, the weapon almost slipped from Garrett's grasp. A federal marshal in Thaddeus's hands that altered everything, and these weren't. Only he might drive off lawless raiders with better firepower if a badge-wearing man was engaged. It indicated that the corruption ran significantly up to territorial authority, which is why we are unable to visit the law, Clara said, her voice becoming louder. Weaker as the blood kept leaking, Garrett has something between her fingertips. Relationships across 3 regions, everyone he will learn about it first after we report it to him. Then we permanently vanish. Through Thaddeus could now see the window individual cyclists atop the ridge, 6 men on that ignored his valley, riding a horse with the assurance of hunters who had surrounded their victim. One of they had on an item that shone in the as the sun shone. Thaddeus sensed the familiar weight of unfeasible decisions, taking a seat on his shoulders, assist these women, and turn become a target himself. Them away and observe their demise in any case? Resulted in outcomes he wasn't certain. He possibly coexist with a root seller who muttered at last, his voice scratchy with choice made behind the cabin using a fictitious I keep items on the floor. For you can hide there in the cold, but Clara shook her head, saying they would look everywhere. These men are meticulous and have been following us for days, and they are aware of their business. The woman who is the youngest and has for the first time fever spoke abruptly. Although her voice was hardly audible, the tension is broken. With words like he's correct to be afraid of the knife we bring. Everywhere we walk, Thaddeus looks at death. Closer to her, and his heart skipped a beat. With corn, she couldn't be older than 16. Blue eyes and silk hair that remained a lot of information for someone so young. WTF monsters like that sold kids the hoof? Betats were now sufficiently near that he could hear men calling and leather squeaking, speaking softly to one another. They were extending all around the ranch with military precision abductors who have committed this repeatedly prior to saying, "Listen to me." Thaddeus' calm voice in spite of the confusion in his thought. I must be certain of what we're handling. How many males, how far will weapons take them? Clara got to know his eyes, and he perceived a great deal of pain. That created his own 3-year self-imposed banishment appears to be a vacation. This place will be completely destroyed. By fire, if anyone who stands in their way must be killed. The way these males don't have their devils in their hearts, Mr. Human flesh via the slats of the shutter. Thaddeus saw it for the first time. The man sat his horse in front of the lead rider, as if his badge belonged to the entire universe, capturing the light while looking around the even from a distance. Ranch structures, the icy calculation was visible to Thaddeus. Wade Garrett's posture revealed that he was the federal marshal who engaged in human trafficking for financial gain. What if you were Thaddeus? Would you stand up and resist? Unfathomable odds given the likelihood of your death, but could potentially spare 6 innocent lives. Discover a means of maybe negotiating preserving oneself, but maybe bringing down the tell me about the women who ended up worse than death. I need to know in the comments which side would you pick, because of what Thaddeus determined next would ascertain if those who were in the cabin would live to witness the authors had paused for another sunrise. Barely beyond rifle range, but near enough to converse, but keep your distance to prevent. Garrett lifted his head in imminent peril. His remarks and voice were definitely audible. Good day, friend. Across the desert air, we are searching for some abandoned property. 6. Ladies who committed self-looting from have you seen anyone who is their rightful owner? Similar to that person who climbed onto, he slung his porch rifle casually in his hands, but they are prepared for the afternoon sun. He faced the broad shadows that stretched across the yard. Down 6 men on horseback who were radiating threatening heat from a martial forge, with his horse seated in the middle of his shining badge on a black vest that too much blood was visible. Haven't seen anyone? Thaddeus retracted his voice, speaking in a man's flat tone used to being alone. Don't get many guests outside. Garrett's grin was frigid as winter stone. It's okay if we occasionally look around, people. Hide where they believe no one will locate them within the building behind Thaddeus' hut. He heard the distant noises of the women's attempt to conceal their Clara's breathing had become quiet, likely unconscious because, to blood loss, the youngest had a temperature that was still burning. They were all not in a position to run even if there was a destination. Thaddeus said, "This is private property, and I don't remember inviting you," he said. For the purpose of searching it, one of Garrett's guys dead-eyed. Scarred brute spat federal tobacco juice into the dust control over Trump's personal assets. You have something to conceal. Hermit, or you? Thaddeus felt inherently hostile. Despite this, his forehead was drenched in sweat. These soldiers weren't present in the scorching desert. To bargain, they had already determined that he was concealing anything. The only query was the lengths they would take to make it amusing. Garrett mentioned something regarding hermits. Dismounting gracefully and fluidly, they typically opt for seclusion because they have secrets. Tell me about your secret buddy. The marshal moved his hand closer, idly leaning on his pistol grip. See, for 3 years we have been following those women. Days lost their way almost 1 mile away from this is where the hard ground begins. I now believe that a clever guy might have assisted them in hiding their tracks. Ask why would he act in such a way that Thaddeus could feel as though you're standing on a knife. A woman positioned herself behind him and it was nothing more than a gentle moan of agony. Audible, yet in the quiet of the desert it may have passed for a scream. Garrett's head cocked in a slight, "What was that wind?" The valve caught a whiff. Quickly, Thaddeus said, "Loose board in the roof," but Garrett had already started to move. He practiced drawing his weapon. "Guys, smoothness, I believe our hermit. Why don't friends who have been holding secrets? We have a thorough examination." Of the other 5 men, all dismounted at once. Their coordinated motions, and these weren't just any thugs, they were effective. They had done this like pros. Countless times before Thaddeus came to terms with icy conviction that he can negotiate. His way out was out of the question as Garrett put his boots on and strolled onto the porch. He made a creaking sound against the worn wood, spoke with a threat of violence. "This is what will occur. You're going to take a back seat and we will gather our belongings, anybody who becomes buried in the desert, where they will never be discovered. If you like the story, please subscribe to The Water." But as Garrett extended his hand to Thaddeus, decided on the cabin door. That would alter the decision in every way. Something had been growing ever since he had witnessed 6 women kneeling in desperation. Thaddeus lifted his firearm in his yard and with a single fluid motion, the barrel is approaching Garrett's chest is just a few inches away from the... Marshal froze, but his hand continued to reach. His eyes were widening for the door handle. I said, surprised and calculating. Thaddeus said, "This is private property," continued in a deadly calm voice, "and I intended it." For a moment, the world breath held. 6 firearms were abruptly trained in the yard below on Thaddeus. However, his rifle remained steady from the marshal's face, and Garrett's heart went through a range of emotions, including astonishment and indignation. "And lastly, you're showing chilly respect." Garrett, a mistaken buddy, remarked quietly, "A huge one. Those women are ours. Purchased and compensated for your meddling with legal." Thaddeus's laugh. Lawful commerce was as bitter as slavery's alkali dust. Been unlawful for many years. Marshal even Garrett's smile here in the territories, extremely slender and rapacious. These aren't hermit slaves, are indentured servants. Contracts were signed by servants, and everything they have obligations to pay, and our purpose is to gather inside the cabin. Clara's voice sounded feeble to Thaddeus, but vicious lies that we never signed. Took us from a church social after drugging us. Garrett's face darkened in Kansas at being overheard seems to indicate that you have some stolen goods from their friend's property that's making you make bad decisions. The standoff was as long as a wire. Thaddeus realized that the garment was excessively tight. The 7-armed math of his predicament, 6 injured ladies against 1 man stuck between the lines. Even if Garrett would be slashed by the others. If he died? Down prior to him being able to operate the rifle's lever, but occasionally math didn't issue. A man occasionally had to make a stand, notwithstanding the odds. Here's Thaddeus stated his thoughts on what might happen. Voice with the power of absolute faith that you will return to. You're leaving with your horses. To forget you've ever been here or these women, and you will discover, take up a new profession. Garrett's in his saddle. The scarred lieutenant shifted. His boss's jerking gun hand just gives the word is that we can let him go and move on. However, Garrett raised a hand of his. Thaddeus's eyes never leave his face. There was a change in the marshal's look, as though he was observing something hadn't anticipated a man who was already. I believe that you can find peace with death, slowly. Garrett responded, I guess you got history with circumstances such as this. I consider whether you were able to assist someone previously, and now you're attempting to compensate for it. The words sound like Thaddeus felt his bodily assaults. Scratching their carefully concealed recollections, another woman. Another way to the surface, frantic request for assistance at a later time, when he had opted for safety over bravery and seen a cowardly person die. Did I strike a nerve by pressing the Garrett button? Her name was what? Wife, sister, daughter, someone you failed. When it counted, Thaddeus's hold on the rifle became more firm, but his focus remained unwavering. Her name was my wife was Sarah, and I won't make. Garrett nodded, as he made the same error twice. If anything significant had been verified, Sarah's lovely name, and I bet she passed away. Shouting, aware that you were too much of a coward to keep her from getting angry, that blew up in Thaddeus's chest, almost costing for a brief moment. Everything he tensed on the trigger, the finger prepared to terminate Wade Garrett's life in spite of repercussions. But during that white, in a fit of rage, he heard something that altered all of Clara's words from within the cabin. That is hardly audible, but conveying evidently in the air of the desert, that's the man who killed your wife is his name. Thaddeus was struck by the words like lightning. Wade, striking again in the same spot the name he had used for 3 years, was Garrett. Attempting to forget the man who had arrived their homestead, promising protection, who asked Sarah to act as payment when Thaddeus was unable to fulfill his. The individual who had laughed was charged with extortion. When Thaddeus pleaded for forgiveness, who would seize Sarah despite his refusal to, Garrett's eyes gleamed with battle, acknowledgement, and sick satisfaction. Goodwell, Willow Creek's coward Thaddeus Bell. I wanted to know what transpired with you after, like a whipped dog, you fled. The weapon shuddered in Thaddeus's grasp, yet 3 years of guilt, not out of terror and fury, concentrated on one area of fierce animosity. You killed her. I didn't murder her, Garrett remarked mockingly. You did it by being too yellow. She called your name in an attempt to defend her. You may have wondered where she went when she died. Her courageous spouse had gone through it. Something fundamentally broken within his chest, the meticulous walls he had constructed around his sorrow, the sensible justifications he had created for the lies he had told himself were cowardly, about being powerless over everything, collapsed instantly. But here's the lovely aspect. Garrett went on with his voice brimming with malevolent delight. History will soon repeat itself. However, this time, rather than just one woman, you're going to watch me, even though you have 6. Take each and every one of them as if prior to the voice of Thaddeus. Clara grew more powerful due to a frantic rage. Thaddeus, he is lying to you about your wife. Sarah Bell died fighting while calling for you. I'm aware of this because I was among he took the women before her. Discovery struck like a blow to the body that he cocked his head slightly, never taking he looked away from Garrett entirely. Sarah Bell. Clara went on to speak, growing stronger in spite of her injuries.